Hello, welcome back. We recently produced a video on commercial property for beginners, part one. If I can just summarize quickly, some of the concepts that we talked about in the part one video were that commercial property is principally purchased by people that are looking at deriving an income. Therefore, these properties are valued using the income approach or the capitalization of the market rent. And we talked a little bit about cap rates and how commercial properties are valued based on the income as opposed to residential properties where people that buy them, they principally are looking for capital growth, and the income and the yield are a tertiary method of valuation. We also talked about mindset and the need for a mindset change for investors that are principally used to buying residential property and are looking to make the change to commercial property. So video part one was really about mindset change and about the need to look at properties in terms of what income they're deriving, how that income can grow in the future, and whether it's durable or not. So everything's really about cash flow and about mindset. So that's really lesson one, part one, if you like, around investing in commercial property. So those of you that haven't watched my video, please go back and have a quick look through that. And in this video, what I'm going to talk about is the act that governs most of the commercial properties here in Melbourne, and that's the Retail Leases Act. One of the great things I like about buying commercial real estate here in Victoria is the Retail Leases Act that governs leases here in the state. The Retail Leases Act came into play in 2003 and it replaced the Retail Tenancies Act of 1983. And the Retail Leases Act gave a lot of clarity to landlords and tenants around how they should run their business moving forward. And I find it a very, very user-friendly act when compared to the Residential Tenancies Act, which is quite convoluted, highly litigious, and it really requires a property manager, generally speaking, to manage those properties because of the litigious aspect of the document. So I just want to spend this video talking a little bit about the Retail Leases Act. Don't let the word retail confuse you, because retail governs goods and services. So it governs properties like retail and offices and factories, warehouses. There are exclusions, which I'll talk about, but it pretty much governs most of the commercial properties here in Melbourne. What does the Retail Leases Act not apply to? The Retail Leases Act does not apply to properties that have a floor space of more than 1,000 square meters or roughly 10,000 square feet. It's not the metric is 9.27, but let's just say 1,000 square meters. Anything greater than that, the Retail Leases Act does not apply. So then it's just a straight commercial agreement between the landlord and the tenant. It also doesn't apply where the tenants are publicly listed companies. So when the tenant is a publicly listed company and when the floor space is greater than 1,000 square meters, the Retail Leases Act does not apply. I mean, the parties can still refer to it, but there's no requirement, there's no legislative requirement for the landlord and the tenant to conform with the Act. But generally, anything that's under 1,000 square meters and anything where the tenant is a private company, the Retail Leases Act applies, and therefore it covers pretty much most of the commercial properties in Melbourne. The landlord is required to provide the tenant a disclosure statement, which I'll cover off shortly, and a draft lease within 14 days of signing. If the landlord doesn't do this, the tenant then has a right to rescind the contract, okay, post signing. So this is really, really critical. The landlord must provide the disclosure statement and a draft lease to the tenant 14 days before signing. And I wanted to cover off on some of the things that are in the disclosure statement. So with a commercial lease, it's important for investors to understand the difference between a term and an option. The term is the term of the lease. So for example, if a tenant takes up a 3-year lease, that's a 3-year term. If they take up a 2-year lease, that's a 2-year term. The option is the option for the tenant to take up an additional term. So sometimes you'll see 3 by 3 by 3. That means that the tenant has a term of 3 years with the option for another 3 and an option for another 3. So 3 by 3 by 3 gives the tenant the option for a 9-year lease, but at any 3-year period they can decide to move out, to vacate, and to not take up that option. So it's important to understand that the option is the option to the tenant, not to the landlord, right? So it's very important to understand the difference between a term and an option. A term is the lease period. The option is the right for the tenant to take up an additional term. Now, when rent is calculated under the Retail Leases Act, rent increases can only be calculated in 3 different ways. And what's illegal is a ratchet clause, and I'll explain what a ratchet clause is. So when every year the landlord can decide to increase the rent under the lease. Now, the rent can be increased either by CPI, which is just the Consumer Price Index. It can be a fixed increase, maybe 2 or 3%, or the rent can be increased via market, right? What you can't do is you can't, like in the old days, say rent is to be determined either by CPI, market value, or fixed increase, whichever is the higher. That's a ratchet clause, which allows, in the old days, the landlord would just sort of cherry pick whichever method was the highest and they go with that. So you can't do that under the Retail Leases Act. Under the Retail Leases Act, you need to be very clear how rent is to be determined. And often here in Melbourne, what happens is leases are determined annually via CPI or fixed increase. And usually when it's time for the tenant to determine whether they want to take up the option, rent is then determined usually via market, okay? But that's not necessarily required. It's whatever the landlord and the tenant agree. So as long as they agree to one method, that's fine. What the landlord can't do is implement a ratchet clause, which is illegal. For those commercial leases here in Victoria that are not governed by the Retail Leases Act, a ratchet clause is not illegal. So it's not illegal to have a ratchet clause, for example, in a premises where you have Bunnings, which is a publicly listed tenant, or you have a public company like Lululemon. A ratchet clause, however, is not illegal when the lease is not governed by the Retail Leases Act, i.e. when the floor space is greater than 1,000 square metres or where the tenant is public. In that particular situation, you can include a ratchet clause, but otherwise you can't. The rent needs to be determined by one of the 3 methods during the term and during the option period.
What's the secret to a good coffee?
Okay, secret to a good coffee is the balance between acidity and obviously a good barista. Well, apart from that,
Acidity?
acidity.
What do you mean?
In reference to the bitterness of the coffee, which is the acidity level.
How do you determine that?
The beans. The beans have got the balance of the beans. So you'll have beans that are dark. You'll have a medium roast, so dark roast, medium roast, and light roast, and they all have all different sort of acidity levels. So that's the reference for that.
And which one do you use?
We use a medium roast.
Medium roast.
Yeah, so the acidity is not high.
The other requirement by the Retail Leases Act is that the landlord, 6 months before the end of the term, need to provide the tenant a reminder asking the tenant whether they plan to take up the option. And the tenant needs to respond back to the landlord 3 months before the expiration of that term, whether they're going to take up the option or not. Now, that's a great system because, one, the tenant is reminded, given ample time, 6 months before the expiration of the term, they're reminded, and the tenant is giving the landlord ample time 3 months before the end of the term as to whether they're going to take up the option or not. So that will allow then the landlord to advertise the property for lease if the tenant does not wish to take up the option. So that's just a great system that works under the Retail Leases Act. One of the requirements under the Retail Leases Act is that the landlord needs to disclose all the outgoings, and that's the purpose of the disclosure statement. So what the disclosure statement does, it discloses the proposed draft rental over the term of the lease, but what it also does, it discloses all the outgoings, okay, all the costs, whether it be rates, owner's court fees for those that are strata properties, any insurances, any other fees imposed by council, any insurance, any building insurance, and any other sort of fees that the tenant needs to be mindful of. Now, under the The Retail Leases Act, though, a landlord cannot impose land tax. So land tax is one of those things that's why it's such a curly subject here in Victoria, because a while back what the government did is they said, well, landlords can't pass on land tax. So now they absorb it, and generally speaking, what they try to do is pass it on via rent, but that's not always the case. So all the expenses that a tenant is likely to pay for, in addition to the rent, is disclosed in the disclosure statement, which is provided 14 days prior, together with the draft lease, 14 days prior to the tenant signing. So they need to be given ample time to go through the disclosure statement to identify any costs that they're not. Now, failure to do that will mean that the tenant has the ability to rescind the contract at any time. So that's really, really critical. So the disclosure statement is a very, very important part of the Retail Leases Act. Now, during the course of the lease, there are repairs and maintenance that are required. Generally speaking, under the Retail Leases Act, the landlord is responsible for structural defects. So things like water ingress or where structural intervention is required, that's usually the landlord's responsibility. But generally things like wear and tear, that's something that the tenant looks after. So it's fairly clear. Some of these things haven't been tested, like services, for example, haven't been tested at VCAT, but generally speaking, maintenance is a tenant issue. CapEx or capital expenditure on structural issues, landlord requirements. The landlord also generally can't pass on the legal costs to the tenant, and usually disputes, there's a small business commissioner that deals with any disputes, but generally disputes, because the Retail Leases Act is so clear, it's very, very hard to dispute things because the law is pretty clear, and that's what I like about the Act. Now, no system is perfect, of course, but the Retail Leases Act has a really good process, or there's a really good governing process for disputes, especially around rent, which makes up most of the disputes. And typically that arises when a landlord proposes a new rent at option, the tenant disagrees, and what the Act requires is if the two parties can't agree, both parties appoint a valuer from the Australian Property Institute. That sometimes takes about a month. Valuation comes in and both parties have to adhere to that new market rent. So moving forward, no party is at disadvantage, if you like, because they're both receiving and paying a market rent for that property. So even with disputes, there's a really, really good resolution process. So that's pretty much it. It's really important to understand the Retail Leases Act. You should read it and understand it if you want to invest in commercial property in Melbourne. And that's part 2 of investing in commercial property.
It's making a beautiful piccolo.
Piccolo.
Yeah. With a bit of a heart.
I love heart too. How long did it take you to learn how to make the love hearts?
A love heart's one of the more simpler patterns. Doesn't take that long, as long as the practice makes perfect. It doesn't take that long. It's just a cappuccino. And thank you, sir. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you.
And this is your coffee.
Okay. Comes with love.
Absolutely.